My name is Chris Healy. I'm the branch chair for IOSH Staffordshire, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. We wanted to ensure that we continue to undertake branch activities in these present circumstances as much as possible, and saw this as the very best way to continue branch meetings until further notice. We at IOSH Staffordshire Branch are proud to produce professional, relevant, engaging and thought-provoking events for our members, and this is certainly going to be one of those. We exist to support our members, the profession and wider world of health and safety. This work forms part of the three pillars of IOSH Work 2022. That is to influence, enhance and collaborate across the industry, which is part of IOSH's 5-year strategy to shape the future of health and safety. This event has been born from three parts for your information. That is the requirements to deliver events related to IOSH Work 2022, from the requests from branch members left on our event feedback forms, which is very important to us, and the general need for topical, interesting, and of course engaging subjects. So tonight, I have no doubt this will be a very interesting area of health and safety, and for me certainly something brand new. So I would like to introduce you to Alan Spence, Head of Corporate Passenger and Public Safety for Network Rail. But before I do, I just wanted to take a moment to share with you, certainly many that may not know Alan's past and current role, that Alan joined Network Rail in 2012 to create the company's strategy for transforming safety and well-being. He's been at the heart of the company's shift towards its vision of everyone home safe every day. And he is currently leading the company's work in all aspects of passenger and public safety. He is the Vice Chair of the Cross-Industry System Safety Risk Group and Chair of the Specialist Group covering level crossing safety. His career was originally as a safety regulator with experience in many different career industries. In 2000, Alan joined the then Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate and moved with the Inspectorate to the newly combined Safety and Economic Regulator, the Office of Rail Regulation, becoming Her Majesty's Deputy Chief Inspector. His rail experience spans all aspects of the British industry, including infrastructure, management, operators, major projects, light rail and the heritage sector, as well as work with overseas regulators and railway companies. He also draws on his experience with many other industries, including his roots in agriculture. So thank you, Alan, for your time tonight. We're really privileged to have you to give up your time this evening to come and speak to us at IOSH Staffordshire. And please, I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Right, I'm hoping that people on the webinar are able to see my screen, which should be telling you that I have to talk to you this afternoon about protecting the public from harm. Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction, and good evening to all of those who've decided to join this rather than to have your early tea ready for the applause for our NHS and care workers. My role in Network Rail is perhaps a little unusual in the terms of a safety professional, in that most of us working in the safety profession will be dealing with protecting our own staff from harm, whether that is occupational health risk or physical safety risk. But my role focuses very much on the way that the railway system works to keep those who are not part of travelling on the railway and indeed are not employed by the railway, but nonetheless can come to harm. So I thought it was useful to give you a flavour of the Network Rail. Network Rail is Britain's mainline railway infrastructure manager. We manage a network which is some 20,000 miles of track, spanning right from the very north of Scotland in the Wick area down to the far south of Cornwall. On that infrastructure, we have some 40,000 bridges and tunnels, and we have staff of around 42,000 direct employees, with a supply chain in the contract world of something around 100,000 more. So significant enterprise to operate the infrastructure to maintain that infrastructure and to renew the bits and enhance the bits that we decide are appropriate. That infrastructure enables the passenger operators to run some 23,000 passenger trains every day, and total journey in the year would be around about 1.7 billion passenger journeys. That has steadily increased from the point of privatisation by a significant amount. It has more than doubled. 2020 will see that change significantly, but more of that in a moment. In addition to the passenger services, and ours is predominantly a passenger railway normally, we run around about 500 freight trains every day as well. And of course, in the current pandemic crisis that the country, indeed that the world is facing, we've slightly changed the railway. We've adapted the passenger timetable to be running a limited service for key workers to get them to and from the places they need to provide the care and to keep the infrastructure of the country running, but also to feed things like biomass going into power stations or food moving around getting to the supermarket supply chain. So a vital part of keeping the country working, even though we are in lockdown and we don't have quite so many passengers running, and that 1.7 billion will definitely shrink before the end of the year. So on that railway infrastructure, perhaps a little bit about the share of harm, the way that risk distributes across that. As an industry, we run a safety risk model. It's run by the Rail Safety Standards Board. Just to give you a very high level, around about a quarter of that is taken up by the green slot, at the lower green slot there, workforce injuries. The upper green slot is injuries in yards, depots and sidings, again workforce. And then the yellow bit there are the passenger injuries. The predominant passenger injuries being slips, trips and falls in stations, and a few other more serious but very, very limited number of very serious injuries. In fact, we run an enviable record in terms of the safety of our network, in that I always make sure I'm touching wood when I say this, but the last passenger to die in a catastrophic train accident in the UK was Margaret Masson on the 23rd of February 2007. There is no other railway that can offer that sort of history, given the volume of trains, the amount of passengers that we carry. But that's not what I'm here to talk about this evening. The blue set there, these are the public injuries on the mainline railway. And don't worry about the numbers, it's fatalities and weighted injuries. So that is a computation of fatals, serious injuries and lesser injuries. But it just gives you an idea of the scale of harm, and public injuries account for a significant amount of concern for us as a business. The grey slot there, I've deliberately obscured the bits that the critical information. That is the very sad tale of those who deliberately choose the railway to harm themselves, those who seek to end their lives, or at least to end the lives that they're living, and use the railway as a place for suicide. And I shall cover the blue and the grey bits in the bits I'm going to talk to you tonight. That's 3/4 of the overall harm on the railway network. So first of all, I want to talk to you about the place where people have the right to share the same space as trains. We just try to make sure that's not at the same time as the train. We have a significant number of level crossings on the network. This is a Victorian legacy. We'd never build a railway now with level crossings. And in the days of slowish steam trains, horses and carts, and a lot of pedestrians, and a huge staff of the railway, it was a perfectly manageable risk for level crossings to be the way in which people maintained ancient rights of way or accessed pieces of land from one side of the railway to the other. Today, we have reduced the number of level crossings significantly over the last 10 years. In that time, we've managed to close, either by buying outright or providing alternative accesses, some 1,254 level crossings. You might think that's a massive success, so it is. That's a huge effort that we've put into doing that, but we do still have 5,824 crossings on our network. And on those crossings, not all of them are the sorts of crossings that you'll be used to seeing as you drive around and come across flashing red lights and red and white barriers and such like. The vast majority of those crossings are footpath or bridleway crossings, most of which rely on the user taking the decision whether it is safe to cross. More of that in a moment. So what's the overall scale of harm here? Well, this is a picture over the last 5 years, and this isn't just deaths, hence why the figures above the bars are decimals. What I can tell you is that in 2018-19, we had the lowest ever number of deaths on level crossings from accidents. And that was just 2 fatalities. We've never had the luxury of just 2 fatalities. Excuse me. And what that means is that whilst it's very sad for those who are involved, through all of the efforts that we've put into managing safety on the network, we have taken ourselves from a place where of the order of 10, 12 fatalities a year was common, perhaps normal, and that indeed was already safer than many networks across Europe, and as I said, down to 2. For the year ending 2019-2020 that finished just a fortnight ago, we also had 2 fatalities. And all 4 of those in the last 2 years have been pedestrians using passive level crossings. They're not the complex level crossings with high numbers of users. They tend to be in quieter parts of the network and with limited footfall. But we don't just count the fatalities that happen, so we also obviously give a lot of data and analysis to the incidents that happen. We have seen a steady improvement in the number of road vehicle near misses. So when road vehicles are doing the wrong thing for one reason or another, and that's an encouraging picture. If you look at the equivalent picture for pedestrians, unfortunately that is flatlined. So for the last 3-4 years, we've seen effectively no change in the number of pedestrian near misses at level crossings. There's a lot more for us to do. So just to give you an idea of that level crossing estate that I was talking about, that 5,824 crossings, not to go into all of the points on here, but these are the various types of crossings. Right at the top there, we have open crossings. These are literally where the road and the railway cross. There are no gates, there are no lights. On those, it's always a low rail speed over there, typically 10 miles an hour, or indeed the train coming to a stand before proceeding over the crossing. And there's relatively few around the country, and I'm really pleased about that because they're ones that drive a lot of confusion, actually, for road users. I draw your attention just to the big chunks. So around about 3/4 of the way down, you'll see footpath, bridleway and station crossings. By far and away the largest slice, around about 40% of all of our crossings. And the red bars on the right, despite being 40% of the crossings, representing something like 18% of the risk. We analyse risk at every single level crossing. We undertake a narrative risk assessment for every single level crossing. We refresh that on a regular cycle, or indeed after incidents. and we inform that narrative risk assessment with a detailed calculation using a risk model, which takes into account the traffic moment, the number of trains, the number of cars or pedestrians. It takes into account sighting, line speed, all sorts of factors, and allows us to be able to target our activity at the crossings where we will get best risk benefit. Towards the bottom of the chart there, you'll see the little acronym AHB. They are automatic half barrier crossings, and I'll come and talk about those a little more in a moment. So just to put some illustrations of those sorts of crossings, in the distance on this road, there is actually a level crossing just on the crest of that hill. And that level crossing is very difficult to see as you're approaching, with low sun in the sky and a slightly moist road such that the sun is glinting off that. Indeed, this was a picture taken at a level crossing where a young girl was killed 8 years ago, 7 and a bit years ago. But that's on a rural road, level crossing with lights, barriers, and challenges to help the road user to do the right thing as they approach that crossing. Perhaps more typical of the ones that people will see, we have a full barriered crossing with the flashing lights, as euphemistically we call them wigwags, and barriers. And the reason for including this is it's an illustration that no matter what we do, there are occasions where people will simply not follow the road traffic legislation. And so you see the white van that is on the crossing coming through the open side, having weaved around the barrier here. The wigwags are on, so he's done that against the road traffic signal, road traffic offence, and what's convenient is we've caught him. So the reason this picture will be here is that we have the ability through camera technology to catch people who do the wrong things and to take them to task. And we work in partnership with the British Transport Police, a dedicated police service for the railway system, to be able to do that. Sometimes there's not a significant amount of risk created when road drivers do the wrong thing, but certainly infrastructure damage and delay to train services. So here's another example of an HGV driver who's gone past the flashing lights, and as the barrier has descended, has helped to destroy that barrier. You can imagine that not only has the damage, the cost of damage to the infrastructure, it also means that we delay train services and we end up having to temporarily close roads while we restore those barriers back to a safe operation. So that's a huge amount of disruption both for road and rail travellers. And some of that is just absolutely selfish behaviour by the level crossing user. In other times, we have mistakes made by those who are using a level crossing, and we have to ask ourselves whether we've done everything to help that level crossing user do the right thing. So here you have a picture of a parcel delivery van down in Kent, which was struck by a train on a level crossing. The sign at the level crossing said, stop and phone the signaller to see if it's safe before you cross. The van driver says he did not see that sign and opened the gate and went across into the path of a train. And we ask ourselves whether our signs are appropriate. They're statutory signs set out in legislation, but whether they're giving clear information in the current day and age. We ask ourselves whether we've got the right type of crossing to help make sure that the users do the right thing. Just below that, we have a tractor that has been shortened or cut in half as a result of being struck by a train. That's in Yorkshire. And again, the tractor driver not used to this farm crossing, he was visiting, delivering a piece of equipment, has found himself in a place where he didn't follow the signs. In fact, that one had a warning light telling him he shouldn't cross. He didn't follow that and was very lucky that it simply took the engine off his tractor rather than taking him out with it. And finally, I guess, just some of the illustration of things that go wrong, and that is sometimes it's our fault. So here's an illustration of a signalling centre, one of a typical control desks in our signalling centres. And occasionally we have our own staff who make a mistake and give permission to use a level crossing when that is not safe to cross. So those are some of the other challenges we face, dealing with the human issues, not just out there of the people we can't control, the users that are outside our immediate control, but those who we employ, and making sure that they have a doable job with the right tools to help them avoid making mistakes. So I showed you this graph earlier, and I did say a little more about automatic half barrier crossings. So small amount on the network, I think we have 428 on the network at the moment, and yet representing around about a third of all of the risk on the network. These are a very convenient type of crossing. They are automatic half barrier, so tell you what that means. It only has a barrier on the entrance side of the crossing, as you'll see on this illustration, not on the exit side for British drivers. They operate automatically, so they're triggered by the approaching train. There's no human interaction that decides whether the crossing is safe. Once the train strikes in, it comes over the crossing at line speed, and there is no ability to stop that train, and there's no intervention to check that the crossing is safe. That may sound like a little bit of a casual approach. These were introduced into the UK in the 1960s, and they were introduced for good reason, because they mean that the road is closed for the minimum amount of time that is possible. And the legislation obliges us not only to consider safety risk, but also convenience in designing and determining the right precautions at our level crossings. So here we have a crossing design where 90% of the train should arrive within 27 seconds of the lights and barriers operating, which means that in well under a minute, the whole crossing cycle can have finished, and we've delayed the road users by a minimal amount. That has the positive safety benefit that most road users know that they'll be delayed by a very short amount of time, and they're not tempted to skip around the barriers or to in some way compromise their own safety at the crossing. So by having it with a short cycle time, you incentivize the responsible user behavior. There are a couple of downsides to that sort of crossing. As described, the way it operates, with it being automatic, this is a particularly egregious accident in Berkshire in 2004, where somebody decided to take their own life on that level crossing, parked their car and waited for it to be hit by the train. The high-speed train from London Paddington heading into the West Country struck the car, derailed as a result of striking that car, and then you see the point work that is just after the level crossing. The derailed train then on that point work was catastrophically derailed. 7 people died in that accident, including the train driver. And it was a particularly difficult scene. We have since, and it took us a very long time to get all of the permissions in place and to get the community agreement, we have since closed and put a replacement bridge into that level crossing. But nonetheless, here's an example of an automatic half barrier where there was no human intervention to stop the train when that car driver decided to take their own life. and we ended up with a very serious incident. Rather more recently, back in 2018, there was another example, and in this one, we'll never know exactly what happened, but the best understanding is that a grandfather driving his grandson to football practice one weekend morning arrived at the level crossing very, very close to their home. So he was familiar with it. He drove over it many times a week. And as he glanced to one way and saw a train approaching in the distance, he decided it would be all right to skip round the barriers and they wouldn't be late for football practice. What he didn't take account of was the train approaching on the other track in the other direction, which was right upon him. Both of the car occupants were killed. So a very sad event for a family, losing grandfather and grandson in a single event. And of course, for a very traumatic event for train drivers and passengers who literally had a grandstand view of the aftermath of that accident with the severe fire and the loss of life that was associated. Whenever a car strikes a road vehicle at a crossing, it is lucky if it doesn't derail. As you see in the left-hand photograph, the effects can be catastrophic. In this instance, the train didn't derail, and thankfully there were no harm to people travelling on the trains. So what can we do about these automatic half-barrier crossings? Well, one of the things we can do is work with our, say, British Transport Police partners. I have 15 of these vans. They're owned by Network Rail. We provide them for use by the police, and they travel around the country, set up with ANPR technology and other cameras on board, and either with police officer or police staff on board can take enforcement action for those who misuse the level crossings, such as the ones you've just seen. They're quite resource intensive. The fleet of vans are now approaching their end of life. We put them in 2012, and so we are progressively moving to fixed camera technology that we've developed and got Home Office approval for. These digital cameras don't need somebody to go and download wet film. They don't need somebody sitting there taking the details and writing out tickets. They're processed electronically by one of the police forces for us, and we're able to help to encourage the right behaviour at the level crossings. So if you see either of those bits of technology, the kind of daffodil looking thing on the left there, or the rather space age SEA version up on the lamppost, they're there to enforce compliance with the law at our level crossings. The other approach that we take, of course, and curiously it's one of the 15 vans, is we engage with people and try to educate. And so we'll go to the county shows and the other sorts of environments where people gather with British Transport Police and help to encourage people to be doing the right thing. Now, when we do catch people committing offences at level crossings, a big part of our policy, and we agree this with the police, it's a collaborative effort rather than something that's done solely by them as an enforcing agency, and that is that we use a significant amount of an alternative to prosecution. Given that this is a gathering of safety professionals, I guess that very, very few of you will ever have been done for speeding. But if there was the odd rogue among you who has and has found themselves just slightly over the limit, you might have been offered a training course to re-chip you. And the design of that is that it helps people to avoid points on their licence, to get some learning and to avoid that behaviour in future, and yet to still have a penalty, a financial penalty, the cost of the course, that's broadly equivalent to the fine that you would get. So we use that approach with our level crossings. We see an extremely low rate of reoffending. And so you see that the blue parts of the bars here, each of the bars represents a different level crossing fitted with fixed cameras in a particular trial area. And the blue bars, the lion's share of all of those outcomes, are offering the training course that's run for BTP by AA Drive Tech. Costs the same as the fine, still takes up a bit of your time, but is an opportunity to learn, to adapt your behaviour, and then to have the conversation in the pub with the family, wherever you engage with others, to say, actually, do you know what? I've learned quite a lot about level crossings. I've learned why it's utterly stupid to go through the red lights, taking a chance. I won't do it again. Learn from what I've done. And that's a very positive way for us to help to spread the message, to encourage the better public behaviour. Of course, it doesn't always work. So here's level crossing in Cambridgeshire that we were, Suffolk. And in fact, it was on a day that we were launching one of our level crossing campaigns and talking about the ways in which we would be helping people to learn what to do. Here's I can't remember which TV station it was. It may well have been ITV, I think. We're covering this, and whilst the reporter was filming on site, the Audi was in a hurry to get somewhere, and it was a feeble excuse, I seem to recall, and decided that the red lights didn't apply to them, and it would be okay. Indeed, it was quite useful to have the TV cameras there, because yes, they also got nicked. It's not all about roads, public roads, as I said earlier. So here's where I experiment and hope that video works. So I'm sure somebody will advise if it doesn't. This is quite a valuable resource for us, which is forward-facing cameras on trains. The lion's share of passenger trains, not all, perhaps about 85%, and some of the freight trains in this country are fitted with forward-facing cameras. And it enables us to gather evidence and deal with issues that emerge. And as this train is approaching at line speed, you see that car went over the level crossing, just getting away with it. We were able to get the details of that car going into a private sort of commercial area over a private level crossing. It's not a public road. And the car driver was indeed subject of having his collar felt by the BTP. But that, of course, only deals with that driver, because just 3 weeks later, we have another incident at the same level crossing. And you see in this instance, this illustrates why the activity of the first driver and indeed the second was so dangerous, in that this is a crossing fitted with red and green lights. There's an automated system there that tells you when it's safe to cross or not. There's an audible, a sounder, and red and green lights. And in this instance, a car has done exactly the same as the first, but not had the same margin, and was taken out by the freight train. In that instance, the car driver had a little bit of a history. And as well as his level crossing offence, there were a number of others, which meant that he spent a period of time at Her Majesty's pleasure to think about the error of his ways. So enforcement is a key part of what we do, as well as that re-education that we do when people are behaving unsafely, but without the aggravating factors. Our overall approach to level crossings is governed through our overall strategy. So we have a company strategy, it's a 10-year approach, and it focuses on the various components of how we manage our estate to run the level crossing safely. And you see that the core components of that on the right-hand side of the slide: competence management being our signallers, our level crossing managers, those who deal with level crossing risk, making sure that they're fully aware, able to do good quality risk assessments, able to follow instructions and have the right tools, and the way in which we continually manage that competence. Education and enforcement, I've talked about working with both BTP and our own community safety managers to encourage public compliance. Risk management, we talked about doing risk assessments at every single level crossing so that we understand the risk, we can target our improvement activity, we can make sure that the design of the crossing is appropriate to the type of use, and then deploying technology, whether that is more red and green technology, such as in that last picture I showed you, or thinking about the ways in which we can use obstacle detection to improve the safety at crossings, always having to balance that safety and user convenience that I spoke about earlier on. And the whole thing is wrapped up in that need for effective collaboration across the industry, so that all of the various stakeholders, train operators, police, ourselves, industry bodies, work together to make the whole railway system drive the level crossings, leading to that, albeit still 2 tragedies last year, that safest picture that exists certainly across Europe and indeed in the vast majority of the world. So I'm going to move on next to a subject which is not an area where we actively are responsible for an asset, but nonetheless a significant problem to the industry, and that's where people use the railway as a place to play, as a place to take shortcuts, or exercise the dog, or gather with friends, or whatever. So we lump it under the general term of trespass. Trends. Around about 3 years ago, we saw a significant uptick in the rate of trespass, as you'll see in the 2017-18 time. That led to concern being expressed from the Chief Constable of BTP, and we pulled together a cross-industry trespass improvement programme. I'm the Senior Responsible Officer for that, and we're targeting railway trespass in a variety of ways, trying to drive down the number of events and indeed the number of casualties as a result of that. It is, as you see from that relatively flat line, not job done as yet, but nonetheless, what we have seen in the course of the last 3 years is a significant improvement in the number of fatalities associated with trespass. And last year, the year just finished a fortnight ago, it is provisional data until it's validated in the next few weeks. I believe we have got to the point of the lowest number of trespass fatalities now for a very long time, for around about a decade, and that's encouraging, but there's still a lot more to do. Trespass is not just about preventing deaths, but all of those incidents that you see in the graph at the top represent disruption to the network. Every day, around about 440 trains are delayed on average by trespass events. And that amounts to, across the course of a year, something like 13,500 trespass events. Significant amount of those, from the research we've done, involve young people. So we looked at how to influence those young people. And the research we did told us there is no good having a figure of authority, either with pips on their shoulder as a policeman, or with a collar and tie, or indeed orange on as a railway manager. They don't listen to us. But young people, particularly young adolescent males, do listen to their peers. That was quite powerful. That's useful information. They also believe they're immortal, because at that age, no harm is going to come to them. They're going to live forever. But the one thing they do fear is permanent disablement. So the idea of suffering a terrible injury but not being killed is more fearful for them, more of a deterrent than a threat of you will be killed. And they also are desperate not to cause anguish to female members of their family, their mothers, their sisters, their aunties, their grannies. And so we play on those factors in the way in which we try to influence youths not to trespass on the line. And it's quite useful intelligence for us to think about how we're going to change that public behaviour. So we built this brand of you versus train. This is lifted straight from the website that we have. We don't have any railway branding on it or police branding on it. It's a completely bland website under the youversustrain.co.uk address. And the phrase there, the strap line of everyone loses when you step on the track. And that's because it's not just the individuals, it's also families, it's also the travelling public and such like. And if my technology is working as I hope, I just want to show you very briefly the film that we use to illustrate that. I'm hoping I've picked the right one here.
Oh, this is a beautiful sight.
Dan is free, cuz. Get yourself down here ASAP.
See.
Powers on Staffordshire Branch. He's on the third rail. Extensive third-degree burns.
Hello, can you hear me? Open your eyes if you can hear me.
Hi, sweetheart. My train's been delayed. Kids on the track, apparently. You're going to have to sort your own dinner, I'm afraid. Just give me a text when you get this. Love you.
So you see that what we're doing there, so where I now don't know how to get out of this. Bear with me a moment. So we played there on the risk of injury. We played there on the mother. And we didn't show somebody who's died. We made sure that the implication is that they've got third-degree burns rather than that they're instantly going to be a fatality casualty. We don't just do this on our own. We're working through a whole number of other agencies and partners to help us to reach these quite difficult to reach groups. So we work with the English Football League Trust through their clubs and their charitable activities. They have a marvellous reach into some socio-economic deprived areas, and they're doing a fantastic coverage to get in there at those communities and help us target hotspot trespass locations. Similarly, there's a charity called Street Games helping with kids who are in very deprived areas and getting out there, working in communities in those hotspot areas in partnership with the others. We clearly use social media, not just from ourselves, but from those other organisations. And this is perhaps one of the biggest successes, an education partner, Learn Live, using broadcast ways of getting into schools. I think this is a really powerful medium. Schools seem to draw on it well. And so far, our Learn Live partner has reached 5 million school-age children. We ran a Trespass Awareness Week back in March. It was long planned, and I think unfortunately it happened to coincide with the first week of the COVID lockdown. And yet we still ran it, and Learn Live were able to run seminar sessions which families were able to dial into as part of the homeschooling. So it didn't have to be in a school environment, which further helped get this message across just at the time of we got good weather and kids out of school and day length increasing, and lo and behold, that's the time when the trespass risk goes up. All of that wrapped together, of course, by the partnership with ourselves, with the train and freight operating companies, and with British Transport Police to help to drive home this message and encourage this move towards trespass being a socially unacceptable act. I don't want to go into all of the detail on this slide, but just to give you an idea, this is massive numbers. I mentioned the Learn Live 5 million reach. Overall, all of the things that we've done through the U versus Train brand, with all of the various broadcast, print media, social media, and other ways which we've done it through partnerships, over 250 million opportunities that we've got out there for our messages to get to the people that needed to do so. And look over here on the right-hand side, what we've managed to achieve here in the period through to, from April 19, is we've managed in total trespass incidents reduced by 24% in the hotspots that we targeted. We've driven down youth incidents by a third. We've reduced the amount of delay to passengers on trains, and the costs to the industry associated with that, the costs have reduced again by 31%. So massive impact when you consider that this costs us tens of millions of pounds every year in those delay costs. And so we're really pleased with the impact of this, and think that it's quite a powerful way to try to change that public behaviour. Third area I wanted to talk to you about are those who choose the railway to do themselves harm. I have a team who operate on behalf of the whole industry, working with partners to reduce the amount of suicide on our network. And I guess just to illustrate why it really matters to us, first of all, there's the impact on the train driver, who can do nothing about it. If somebody stands in front of a train determined to take their life, the train driver is powerless, but they have a ringside view. It's not a nice place to be. They will always take time off after a suicide, and in some cases never return to driving. A lot of suicides happen in areas where others are working, so station staff and such like. Again, same sort of impacts. It's a huge impact on the mental health of people working in the rail industry. There's the minor point of equipment damage. It doesn't derail trains if somebody stands in front of it, does if they park a car. But nonetheless, you still get a lot of damage and units out of service, providing an impaired service for passengers. For every suicide, and this isn't just railway suicides, the NHS has a cost of something like £1.7 million dealing with the mental health consequences of that. So all the suicide that we can drive out is helping that overall burden on society and the cost and distraction, frankly, for the NHS. Sometimes our suicide victims on the railway are young. We've had young teenagers on occasion, and so of course you've got that cost, that robbing of a life at a very early stage. Talk about cost, that there's a massive impact on the railway itself. So each incident will cost us somewhere between £250,000 and, at the very extreme, even up towards 10, perhaps £12 million, because of the consequential costs both for staff and indeed for delays. And of course, all of that amounts to huge disruption and inconvenience for the hundreds of thousands of travelling passengers who are trying to use the railway to get home, to see loved ones, or whatever else. So it's a massive problem. And how many? Well, we have been using a figure of around about 250 suicides on the railway every year. Unfortunately, last year, that's to the year ending March 19, we saw that go up to 271. And indeed, hot off the press, the data for the year just ended a fortnight ago will go up again, provisional figure of somewhere about 282. And I say provisional because we do make decisions on the ovens down criteria about whether an event is likely to be suicide, and then we do adjust that data if an inquest later rules differently. So a massive impact, but what's encouraging, if you can take any encouragement out of 280 deaths on our network in a year, is that represents a diminishing share of suicides in society. So in 2018-19, that 271 was down to 4% of suicides nationally, Previously, we had been in the area of 4.5% of suicides nationally. So small when you think of the overall problem for society, but massive in its impact, not only on the families of those who choose to take their lives on the railway, but also all those who I outlined a moment ago are involved in it. The positive story is that for every suicide that is completed on the network, interventions of one way or another, stopping somebody before they take their life, means that we manage to intervene and stop 6 attempts for every suicide that is completed. And that's a massive success. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about how we've managed to achieve that. But it means that, again, we've got that positive story, because if somebody has got to the point where they choose to take their own life, what they don't want is to go halfway. They don't want to be left with debilitating injuries. And the fact that some people are injured rather than killed, or indeed that we manage to intervene and stop a considerable proportion, is something powerful by way of a deterrent. So how do we deter suicides on the network? Well, we can use physical barriers, whether they're at platform ends, the blue gates there, or higher integrity fences at key locations, such as the palisade fence at the bottom, or something that sounds really quite innocuous. We call it centre platform fencing. But where we have stations with fast and slow lines, typically the slow lines have the stopping services and the fast lines don't, we put fence up the centre, and that barrier, that indication to somebody that they'd have to go to a separate effort to get across that fence line, is often enough to stop somebody taking their life with a high-speed through train, when normally they would only have access to the stopping train side of that fence. We have a significant partnership we've run now for over 10 years with Samaritans. We're, I think I'm right in saying, one of their, if not the largest single funder of Samaritans activity. They do a huge amount for us, whether they are engagement events or counselling or training or all sorts of functions that they undertake. And there's a massive force for helping to reduce suicide, not only on the railway. So some of our funding, some of our advertising, promotion of the combating suicide messaging is not just on railway premises. Sometimes we've used it on buses, for example, because that's a way of reaching out to the people who may choose the railway as the place they take their life. We've done a lot of research, engaging in political environment. We are seen as leading the way in suicide prevention in Britain, and that's the railway industry, and indeed of any railway in the world. So my lead on suicide prevention is called upon to conferences worldwide, and indeed select committees and such like, because of the way that other sectors can learn from the way the railway has addressed suicide prevention. And one of the ways we've done that is we have trained over 20,000 people in the rail industry in what we call the Managing Suicidal Contacts course, where we help them to be able to identify somebody who is potentially at risk of taking their life, and how to approach them, and the things to say, and some of the coping strategies, and some of the ways in which they can then call for backup help. Every single phone of a Network Rail employee, and I said how many we got earlier on, if you remember the figure, over 40,000. Well, every single person that has a business phone has an app on there which adds to that with the things to look out for and the ways in which to approach someone if you see someone that you think may take their life. So that's just a way of getting information into the hands or the pocket of every member of our staff to help in tackling the problem. And it's part of the reason why we're able to intervene in those 6 occasions for every one that is a completed suicide. One of the ways in which we've then extended that principle is by taking some of the principles of how to intervene and pushing that out so that others are able to do the same thing. And I'll try and show you another film here, which I hope some of you will have seen, but it's one which I have seen countless times, and yet every single time I see it, hairs on the back of my neck raise, and I think it's a massively powerful film.
Attention passengers on platform 11. I'm sorry to announce that there's been a serious incident on the line.
We know that there was one individual involved. She was 28-year-old Sarah Wilson.
Sarah left a note before leaving her house because she had decided to take her own life.
But I'm very pleased to tell you, she didn't go through with it.
Because someone took the time to stop and talk to her. That was all it took to interrupt Sarah's suicidal thoughts.
I know this because I am Sarah. I'm sharing my story today to spread an important message.
That a little small talk can be all it takes to help start someone on a journey to recovery.
So if you think someone might need help, trust your instincts. Stop and have a chat. Even a question about the weather can be enough. Or tell a member of staff. You could help save a life.
So I hope you'll agree that's a powerful film. We've done another one since, but to my mind, that one's still the better of the two. But it's about giving people the permission to use their instincts, trust their instincts. It's about being human. We all, those of us who ride on trains or the tube, we stand there as if we can't even see the person or have any awareness of somebody sitting or standing very close to us. This is about giving people a permission to be human, to have that conversation if there's somebody that, by all accounts, your instincts tell you needs some help. And so that's quite a powerful way in which we can engage a massive, wider army of people to help us in that intervention story. We're also continuing our work on research, and we're research particularly on how we dissuade people from coming to the railway. All of the sorts of messaging I've been giving you here are the sorts of things that go into those messages of this is not a good place to come take your life, and that there are places that you can go and help and get some conversation, some support, because as my suicide prevention lead, it was one of the most powerful things he said to me a little while ago. He said, people who are considering suicide, it's not always that they want to end their life. They don't want to die, they just don't want the life that they've got. And that's quite an important distinction, because if you can break somebody out of that cycle, then you can help them away from suicide for the rest of their natural life, rather than having that that age-old account that, oh well, there's no good stopping them because they'll only go and do it somewhere else. That just is not true. Innovatively, we actually got involved with ITV, and during the middle of Britain's Got Talent last year, there was a silent advert, Britain's first silent advert, which was about Britain Get Talking. So it's all part of the mental health campaign, and we worked with ITV to develop that and had railway content in there as part of that mental health positivity and suicide prevention message. We're moving into using other partners as well as Samaritans, trying to get there to be thinking about how we support people in mental health crisis, rather than just those who've got right to the edge where they've got to the point of ideation of suicide. And finally, we work across the railway industry. We were set a challenge by one of our senior leaders in the industry that there's a lot of volunteer time that we have available in the industry. For Network Rail, for example, every member of staff can take up to 5 working days of volunteer leave, and we're promoting that leave being pushed towards supporting in one way or another Samaritans. And our challenge over the course of the current 5-year control period, we're 1 year into that, is that we'll devote 1 million hours of railway staff time into supporting Samaritans. That's not all about being one of their listening volunteers. It might be about painting one of their premises. It might be about handing out leaflets. It might be about promoting suicide prevention in social media. There's all sorts of ways that we can do this, but actually working to support Samaritans, our ambition across the industry is to put together 1 million hours over the course of the control period. Sorry. And finally, in terms of engaging that next generation of people who will come into the contact with the railway because they live near to it, or they may be tempted to play on it, or perhaps just use it injudiciously. We worked with Mattel, the owner of the Thomas the Tank Engine brand, to develop this storybook last year. Stay Safe with Thomas is available electronically as well as in print version. And we worked with Mattel. In fact, one of my team authored the story so that we're getting messages across there for discussion by really young kids and their families. And it's a powerful way to get in for conversation across the family so that mum and dad get involved in it as well as the youngster. And we're trying to change the next generation so that they realise that the railway is a valuable national asset and not something to be abused. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I've got to the end of the material that I'd intended to talk to you about this evening, and I shall hand back to Chris or Ben to adjudicate any of the questions or challenges that you want to make about the things I've had to say.
Thank you very much, Alan. I've got to say, I've been making a number of notes, and it's quite incredible the amount of positive work you're doing that a lot of people don't see. Of course, you can't advertise everything all the time, but the amount of work that you do is really quite staggering. Certainly a few of many things you've mentioned is barriers is to separate separate effort, take a moment to think. The barriers on the platforms I'm thinking of, to sort of stop people from taking that perhaps knee-jerk reaction. They might have thought about it, but taking the action to kill themselves or harm themselves, that is a really good way, an initiative, isn't it? Because just taking that moment or put into that person that moment to consider what they're doing is a positive interaction, and it's sitting there as a physical barrier all the time. That's really powerful. I think it's okay not to be okay. 20,000 people managing 20,000 managing suicidal courses. I think that's a fantastic intervention that you're putting in place. The number of partners that you've got involved with one of your last slides is absolutely incredible to see how much support is going into to making sure that people don't harm themselves on the railways, whether they mean to, or whether they perhaps innocently perhaps take the wrong pathway. 1 million hours of support, starting the message early. Certainly, I think the Thomas the Tank Engine thing is a very good way to go, because you are literally starting the message earlier, aren't you? I mean, I'm just gone 50. I remember years ago we used to play in building sites. It was a thing that we did when I was in my early days in the 80s. It's breaking that cycle, isn't it, by trying to do things differently. And so I'm really inspired by what you've got, which again I'm sure the members and non-members involved here probably and likely didn't know. So it's a very powerful presentation here, Alan, so thank you again. We've got a few questions. Don't want to hear me rabbiting on, but we've got a few questions here. We've got one anonymous attendees, fair enough. Why in the, I think the second quarter, the highest in vehicle misses over the years displayed? There's more cars in spring. So you might remember that's probably slide 2 or something of yours, Alan.
Yep. It's about level crossings. And actually, I perhaps should have been more clear. We work on a fiscal year, so when we talk about the second quarter, we're actually talking about summer. So that would be from June through to September. And what we see are people using level crossings, the likes of some of the coastal areas around our country where people have got campsites one side of the railway and they're gated, use the word crossing to get across to them, and they're not familiar with using it. That's one example. Holiday making in strange areas of the country, and that's the principal reason why we see an increase in vehicle related ones. Sorry, the other bit is agriculture. Many of the crossings are either field to field type crossings or on farm drives, and you saw the tractor sliced in half at that crossing in Yorkshire. A typical example of why with seasonal work of crop harvest and such like, we do see an increase in agricultural related incidents of vehicles in that summer period. Yes,
okay, fair enough. Yeah, got another question here. It's to do with the crossings that you mentioned earlier on in your presentation. Of course, a lot of those crossings are perhaps unmanned, as you mentioned, the halfway, the half gated crossings and things. Just for general interest here, what would be the normal sort of maximum speed of something like a crossing that you mentioned earlier, where people have to sit at the lights, or you say the half crossings? What's the sort of, what are we looking at as the maximum sort of potential speed on those?
So rail speed. So crossings will be at up to 125 miles an hour, where we have trains going through at that speed. There are certain crossings where there always a lower line speed. So some of the crossings where the driver, the train driver that is, has to observe and check that things are in place, will have a slower speed. So our automatic open crossings that the driver monitors himself, maximum speed is 55 miles an hour. And equally, I said the open crossings where the train approaches very cautiously is typically a 10 miles an hour approach speed. But automatic half barrier crossings, line speed, significant speed, and indeed the full barriered crossings. You saw the pictures earlier of the van that had decided to go through as that crossing sequence is operating, and the tanker lorry. They can be on lines up to 125.
Wow, gosh! So you expect people looking both ways, and I'll give it a go. There's a potential of that train hitting 125 miles an hour at any one of those crossings, potentially, particular crossings. But
what's notable, I talked about the number of fatalities and the preponderance of fatalities at pedestrian crossings, and a notable and disproportionately high number of those fatalities are not at the very high speed crossings. They're actually at the crossings where the trains are travelling at more modest speeds. Commonly or often at crossings which are on a single line, just as that forward-facing footage that you saw, and those feature disproportionately in our fatality data. That tells me that people think they are going to be safer if they can see a train approaching a little slower, but we know that people are not able to take a good decision about that approach speed, and hence why sadly we have the consequences we do.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? This perception of I can give it a go because that train's not as fast as perhaps 125 miles an hour, and then they get into some stuck or miss time, obviously, with dreadful consequences.
Several hundred tons of steel travelling at 30 miles an hour is still going to make a mess of you, as we know, sadly.
Are you on the railways moving towards looking at the newest technology of any interventions where you're able to have some signal to the I say this in a very simplistic way, it'd be a huge thing to roll out, and indeed you're possibly doing this, is something which is some indicator at a distance back where the train's coming towards the crossing to, I mean, if the train's able to lose any sort of speed to create that distance then, and that, you know, that person or vehicle to crossing to sort of reduce the implication. Is there anything in place or?
Yep, so we use obstacle detection technology. So I don't know the exact number, it's somewhere around about 100 crossings across the country now are converted into obstacle detection crossings. And that's a radar and LiDAR system which will scan the crossing to decide whether it is clear, whether all the people and vehicles have got out of the way, and only at that point are the signals cleared for the train to approach. What we have to keep in mind is the fact that trains take an awful long time to stop. They don't have the same driving characteristics and braking characteristics as a rubber-tired vehicle on a road with a great deal of friction there. It's all designed about minimal friction with the tiniest of contact between the steel wheel and the steel rail. And that's why it's a very energy efficient way to move people and goods around the country. And because of that, then it takes that massive amount of weight. So as I said, several hundred tons of train can take up to a mile to stop. And hence, if you're doing controls which are then about the train driver having to adjust the way they drive the train, it has a massive impact on capacity and knock-on delay on the network. And our network with those 23,000 passenger trains a day is a very congested network. So if people have travelled to other countries, and particularly perhaps into North America, and you'll see the lumbering, relatively slow, extremely long freight trains, but they're relatively scarce. Our sprinting passenger services are on a very densely used network, and hence any perturbation, any disruption to that flow leads to a massive knock-on consequence, not just there, but because it operates as a system that can ripple out across the whole railway because of knock-on delays.
Yeah. It's something that we probably don't, I'm sure, appreciate, do we? Often we wouldn't appreciate it if we weren't working in the industry, but it's very interesting that you mentioned that, and it's something we can certainly take away, can't we?
And that knock-on effect, I mean, we talk about calculating delay minutes, and it's essentially adding up all of the minutes delay for all of the trains affected, not just those in the incident, but all of those consequential, the ones following behind that are late, the ones that would be following on with a new service from a terminal station if that one had arrived on time, and all of the rest of that knock-on delay goes into calculating those delay minutes.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got 3 questions here, 2 based on suicide type questions, both from anonymous attendees, which isn't a problem, I totally get that. But 2 questions here. What welfare measures do your staff get if they have been involved in a suicide? Do you share with BTP? And great presentation, thank you. So that's nice to say.
Thank you. Clearly, I was focusing a lot today on the way in which we try to change the behaviour of people outside the business, but we equally recognise the impact on our own people within the industry and those that work with us. We have a process of trauma incident training, which we use in certain instances for key roles. We have our own employee assistance service that's available 24/7 for anyone that wants to call for support after a traumatic event. And we are developing that traumatic incident training, and in fact adopting some of the best practice that's used in other sectors and other parts of our own industry to see how we could be more interventionist. A lot of the expertise has come from military support for those who've been in conflict zones and come across some fairly gruesome sights and experiences. We're not assuming that we've got it right all the time. We're always looking around for how we can improve that to provide the best sort of form of support. What we do know is that a sheep dip does not work. So there's no good in having one solution that you provide or indeed enforce upon everybody that's involved in a similar incident. People deal with them in very different ways, and different people will need different support at different points after an incident. So it's important to have that flexible and have that available for people rather than assuming that it's got to be imposed. One of the things we have learned in the industry is it's not just support for those immediately involved. So if I use the example of the train driver, the person who's been at the front of the train that's watched it happen and can do nothing about it, that we know that they may well need some support, and we'd expect them to be off work for a number of weeks. But what about the relief driver or the driver manager that goes to the scene to go to relieve them and take that train on after the incident? Rarely have we by that time managed to clear up all of the remains of person who's been struck. And when somebody's struck by a train, it's not a tidy event. So that person themselves has an exposure as they go down the side of the track to get to that train that is easy to forget. Just as our first responders, our mobile operations managers, just as British Transport Police, our clean-up contractors, there's a whole variety of people who we expose to some quite gruesome sights, and it's really important to have that support available very widely.
Yeah, no, that's really powerful stuff that you say you're looking after everybody involved, and I think I don't say it lightly, but the sheep dip analogy you used, I think, is a very powerful one, which we can take away from this, as well as many other things, to use in health and safety. As often and historically, I spoke to you the other day talking about people that have for decades been in the rail industry, as I work in some part with those in the waste industry. You have fathers and sons. There's been the come on lad, not come on lad, but I mean, the stiff upper lip of getting on with it, whether it be the father and son, or I've been doing this for decades. It's very difficult to try and change those really concrete cultures, isn't it? And that's a challenge in itself, I'm sure.
Yeah, very established cultures, and that can change some of the behaviours as well. Perhaps less so in the area I've talked about tonight, but when we talk about workforce safety and looking after yourselves in work groups, when you have family members working together, it changes the dynamic, and you will get example where the discipline that's required in safety critical communication slips when you're talking to your son or your brother or your uncle, as is often the case in many of our work sites. And that's something to be aware of, that even if you've trained somebody to behave in a particularly professional way and they know exactly what they should be doing, they're the air traffic control of the railway when they're organising safety critical activity, and yet that can slip if you're over familiar with someone.
Yeah, I think that, again, powerful stuff to take away. We've got another question, in fact, two questions, and indeed, for those folks that are involved here, if you've got a burning question, please, now is your time to type it in, since I'm reading them off the screen. But we've got two further questions, if I may, Alan. Are there line safety courses / advice for non-BTP police forces who attend incidents on railway, and where can this advice be found, please?
Okay, now we know that civil police, or as the euphemistic phrase goes, the county mounties, will be first responders in some instances. Each of those authorities, whether they're local police or ambulance service or indeed fire and rescue service, there's an awful lot of engagement up front, that those people understand the nature of the railway environment, and that there are significant risks to their staff if they choose to go on there prior to arrival of railway disciplined people or indeed British Transport Police. So we don't offer courses specifically. I don't know if there's the facility, if people have a particular need in corners of the country for BTP to be able to offer their training to offer to those local forces. I don't know if that's available, sorry, but we would not encourage people to try to get to be, and I hesitate, but I'll use the phrase, half competent. I'd far sooner that they had the people that knew what they were doing, whether it's at one of our first responding mobile operations managers or BTP.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, of course, competency is absolutely imperative. So yeah, you're absolutely right too.
And the danger being that you know something, but you don't know enough.
That's right. I remember the 4 levels. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I know the unconscious incompetent, and the conscious incompetent, and that sort of stuff. The 4 parts of competency. We've got a question from Tony here. He says, "Great presentation, Alan," which it certainly is. Many interesting points. Along with the efforts that are made to protect passengers and the general public, do Network Rail hold meetings with any organisations that can assist with any further efforts that can be made for safety suicide, as an example? How do you find communication? How do you find communicating across the number of employees and contractors? I suppose, how do you communicate across your network?
So clearly I've tried to cover quite a wide subject area in a shortish space this evening. One of the big things that we do in suicide prevention is working with such a wide group of external agencies, whether they are local authorities, health authorities, politicians, local civil police forces, or whoever. And so there's a massive amount of engagement to capitalise on that local energy and knowledge. I'll use the example, we had a particular spate of events in the Bletchley, Milton Keynes area in the space of something like 9 months. I think we had 7 suicides a couple of years ago. It was there was no immediate link between any of them. It wasn't copycat events as far as we could identify, but nonetheless we had got a significant problem in that area. So we got together all of those various parties. Ian Stewart, the local MP, was a big part of it, along with doctors and all those other parties I mentioned. And by concentrated effort, by taking some of the effort away from just the railway and the railway boundary, but out into those support functions off in society, we were able to make a big difference to the pattern of suicides in that area. Although we have had a couple of attempts since, we, having had that awful pattern of, say, 7 events over a relatively short period, were able to go well over a year without a single suicide in that area as a result of those. And we've taken that case study, we've applied it elsewhere. The Chesterfield area was one, and there are a number of others where we've had a local pattern, and we've gone out and targeted those other organisations. I don't mean in an aggressive way, but getting them to help us using their ways in, their intelligence, their local knowledge in order to make a real impact.
Yeah. Again, very powerful, Alan. Very powerful indeed. And I think local knowledge and making use of, sharing the information across your network, getting people to talk is very important, isn't it? They're the best people to be able to share that message, and turn around perhaps the old guard, but also to encourage the new as well in your industry. Finish off really with perhaps a general question. Certainly I haven't considered a career in the rail industry, and I know there's thousands of people involved across a very wide and diverse network across the rail industry. Where would somebody want to go? And I put this generally because this is for the attendees and also, of course, going to be later added to our YouTube channel. So we'll be able to share this information across a wide network for you and for us after this. Where would people generally tend to go? We're talking primarily at health and safety professionals, but others as well, if they wanted to look at careers in Network Rail, in the rail industry. Where would they normally go?
So Network Rail has just one of the roles in the industry. It's a complex system, as I think I mentioned earlier. So there are 25 or so passenger train operating companies. There's half a dozen significant size freight operating companies, all of whom will have safety professionals working within them. And as well as Network Rail and our contractors, who, as I said, around about 100,000 extra staff in one way or another. So there's lots of ways to work in safety in the railway sector. For Network Rail, we are frequently recruiting. We advertise not just on our own website, the jobs page there, but also using forums, channels such as LinkedIn, and publications out into the safety professional world when we need to recruit safety specialists. And it's I would have to say, having come to the railway 20 years ago, it's a very rewarding industry. There is a massive amount to learn, and that it's been a massive boost to my own career. It actually in just opening my eyes, helping me to learn every single day. I've thrived on it. I've done well out of it, and I would encourage anybody thinking of a career in safety and the railway. It's absolutely worthwhile, and the benefits, the ability to protect the safety of billions of people who travel on the railway, hundreds of thousands of workers, and the millions of people who come into contact with our railway because they live near it or in some other way come into contact with it, and be part of reducing that terrible loss of life, which we have the capacity to erode. Absolutely rewarding.
Yeah, well, I think certainly it's given me a newfound respect for what Network Rail do. Certainly, Alan, I certainly didn't know half of the interventions that you've been involved with, and certainly as 21st century company, again, difficult to get sometimes that message out there, but this presentation has been absolutely fantastic, I've got to say, and there's so many learns and reflections that we can take from this particular presentation. So I wanted to thank you very much indeed for what you've done for us tonight, Alan, and I hope I don't think we had anything that was out of the realms of your knowledge as far as the questions go. So, and I hope I've been able to help in trying to support with those questions.
Indeed, thank you.
But thank you very much, Alan, for your time tonight. I just wanted to finish off with my chair bit for my Alan, just to finish off and thank those necessary that have been involved with this. This is the second time IOSH Staffordshire Branch have had a webinar, and it's been very, very successful. I'm very conscious of the words of Charles Darwin, who said it's not the strongest that survive, it's those most adaptable to change. And certainly IOSH Staffordshire, we're very adaptable. We're adapting to things that are coming round. You know, it's a very challenging time at the minute, but hopefully for our membership, which is who we exist for, this has been a very informative and certainly very, very much an eye-opener for me, and I'm sure for other attendees tonight, regarding the rail industry and lots of the issues that you have to deal with. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank Ben Pollard, who is in the background. He's muted at the minute, I'm sure, but Ben Pollard is the IOSH events coordinator and team leader at IOSH, who has been very swift for the second time to support and certainly make sure that both myself and Alan have been supported and confident and comfortable with the workings of Zoom, which has been very useful to us tonight. So thank you very much, Ben, for your works. Of course, the branch has had to postpone physical branch meetings for the next few months, but we intend on a monthly basis to continue these as far as IOSH Staffordshire Branch goes, and we will obviously, as normal, use in the foremost way LinkedIn for advertising and the committee mailer to communicate with our members. So next next month sees us deliver another webinar, again on a fantastic and fascinating topic, and that is Thursday the 21st of May for your diaries, and that's Jonathan Hitching. He's the head of health and safety at Drayton Manor Park, of course in our area, Staffordshire, who's going to present on theme park safety, and of course definitely not an event to miss. So we will advertise that wide and far and encourage as many members and non-members to participate as possible. This particular video, within a few days, again thanks to Ben, will be put with my assistance on our IOSH YouTube channel for the wider community to be able to access. And of course, there's always very good CPD to use from this. Of course, Alan, I will make sure to share the YouTube link with you so that hopefully you can, you and your staff can dine on that after this particular upload, so that there's the CPD and learns that can come from that. So it's very important to share information and to share learning as far as possible, so that we all, you know, they say every day is a school day, don't they? And certainly every day is a school day for me. So I'll be more than happy to see about getting that shared around. If you are a member of another branch, IOSH branch, or any other health and safety organisation, or perhaps not part of IOSH Staffordshire, we would encourage you to come and look at our YouTube videos on our IOSH Staffordshire Branch YouTube channel, and of course link with us on our IOSH Staffordshire Branch official page on LinkedIn, of course, which is where you can see your career hopefully flourish and grow. I'd like to thank everybody for attending this webinar, particularly, of course, Alan tonight, who's very kindly given up your time. I know you're a very busy man. You mentioned to me about the most recent unfortunate and dreadful fatality you've got to be involved with, and have been involved with, the ones, the gentleman that died in Port Talbot, and so many more. I know your time is very precious, and on behalf of myself as the chair for IOSH Staffordshire and the wider community, thank you so much for sharing something of your industry. I know it's a thumbnail image, but certainly a fantastic, inspirational picture of what you do at Network Rail. So thank you very much for your time tonight, Alan.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Ben, for his support as breaking my virginity in using Zoom.
Thank you very much, and I hope in some way or another, both for attendees and those on IOSH, on YouTube channel, and hopefully for you, Alan, as well. If you are passing IOSH Staffordshire, we would obviously offer you a very warm welcome if you're passing to come and see us again. So we hope to see you again, and of course in person. So to everybody tonight, we're planning on hopefully finishing by 9:30, which it is. It's 7:33 at the minute. And I'm very conscious that for all of us across the board, we need to honour our NHS at 8 p.m, as Alan mentioned earlier. So I'd like to conclude this meeting now, this branch meeting, with thanking you for your attendance, thanking you for your engagement, and be safe, stay at home, and look forward to seeing you next month if we possibly can. And again, thanks, Alan. Look forward to seeing you sometime in the future if we possibly can meet again.